Class? Class! Quiet down! Okay, now that I have your attention, today we're going to be watching a video about the conflict between Brazil and Portugal, better known as the Brazilian War of Independence in the 19th century. Now, class, could anyone tell me, using our prior knowledge of revolutions throughout history, how are these revolutions impacted by events such as the Industrial Revolution and imperialism? And how did these events shape the complex identities and power structures in their respective countries?
I know.
Anyone else? Yes?
The effects of the Industrial Revolution partially changed the rights of the people during the Brazilian War of Revolution, as although independence fostered a new working class identity, the social hierarchy was still unequal and race-based.
Very good. Now, to get a better view of the revolution, we're going to watch a video about the Brazilian War of Independence.
Brazil began as a Portuguese colony in the 1500s when the explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral claimed the land for Portugal.
Hey, this land would low-key be a great addition to my country.
Brazil was an important colony for Portugal because it had lots of rich goodies such as Brazil wood, sugar, coffee, and gold.
In 1807, Napoleonic forces invaded Portugal.
Why did they decide to invade Portugal in the first place?
Napoleon's forces invaded Portugal because it refused to join the continental system, a system designed to economically blockade Britain.
Why did Portugal refuse to join the continental system?
Portugal refused to join the continental system because of its long friendly trade history with Britain, as Britain was one of its oldest allies. Additionally, the primary reason for the invasion was that Portugal refused to close its ports to British goods. Napoleon didn't like this, so he sent out the order for his forces to invade Portugal. This caused the Portuguese royal family to flee from Napoleon's forces.
When they had first arrived in Brazil, it wasn't some beachside paradise resort full of gold and exotic fruits that they thought it was. It was sparsely populated, heavily enslaved, and economically restricted. Slaves.
That's right, we are doing your work, you ignorant royal! But technically we're oppressed and controlled, so we totally couldn't revolt against such a powerful official, no matter how dumb they may seem.
Why didn't the slaves just revolt if they felt so oppressed and controlled? Couldn't they just revolt like the Haitians did?
Great question, and good job remembering our past lessons. The slaves, unfortunately, weren't as organized or even educated as Toussaint Louverture, and didn't have enough resources to organize a rebellion before the Portuguese royals came to Brazil, so nothing like the Haitian Revolution could have happened.
Who's Toussaint Louverture?
Since the royals were going to be staying in Brazil for a while, Portugal issued a decree elevating Brazil to a kingdom equal to Portugal in 1815, which fostered the new economy and working class, partly due to the amount of jobs created.
This was also done because the colony was temporarily acting as the capital for Portugal, and the elevation of Brazil would make the king ruling from Rio legitimate and less politically awkward. Additionally, this would help keep the loyalty of the elites in Brazil that grew more powerful as time went by.
In 1821, King John VI went back to Montevideo, now known as present-day Uruguay, which at the time was in Spanish possession despite John claiming it in 1820. This angered Spain and led to tensions within the Portugal-Spanish border. The Portuguese Cortes met for this issue and decided to call back King John VI to deal with the problems. The Portuguese Cortes were the governing body in Portugal at the time, consisting of the three social classes: the nobles, clergy, and the regular citizens, similar to France's social pyramid of estates.
A war in Spain pressured King John VI to return to Portugal, but there was just one tiny thing. Teensy-weeny thing.
Wait, there's no way you're just gonna leave a country rich in gold and other high in value natural goods that has a major impact on Portugal's economic state to a 23-year-old dude.
So yeah, King John VI left Prince Dom Pedro I as regent and Jose Bonifacio as his chief political advisor.
Who was Jose Bonifacio?
He was... Well, let's think of him as a main influence in achieving Brazil's independence. He was extremely enamored with liberal and humanitarian ideals that stemmed from the European Enlightenment that we learned about in the beginning of the year. He believed that slavery was morally wrong and economically unsustainable. He argued that slavery was a less productive system than a system that was based on free labor.
However, after King John returned to Portugal, many Portuguese Cortes demanded that Brazilian government offices be moved back to Portugal. Attempting to make Brazil a colony again.
The Cortes wanted to revert Brazil's status back to a colony because they thought that it would restore Portugal's own economic superiority after the French invasions. They were also possibly maybe just a little bit jealous of Brazil's excessive resources like sugar and gold.
The Portuguese people were not happy that one of the colonies that they ruled over had been promoted to have equal power with them.
Brazil, however, did not want to lose their newly gained political power.
This action threatened many Brazilian civilians, especially merchants, politicians, and soldiers, and was the spark of the beginning of the War of Independence. In 1822, many Brazilians encouraged Prince Dom Pedro I to stay in Brazil to secure Brazil's autonomy further. He chose to stay, despite being called back to Portugal.
Additionally, in the February of 1822, there were the first skirmishes of Brazilian independence. In September of the same year, Dom Pedro I proclaimed Brazil's independence, marking the formal break of Brazil from Portugal.
Independence or death?
The recognition of Brazil's independence was still a problem for maintaining the stability of the new state. And a result of this, many provinces such as Bahia, Maranhão, Piauí, Pará, and Cisplatina became active battle zones,
with the majority of Portuguese-born merchants staying loyal to Lisbon, whilst most of the Brazil-born elites supported independence.
On May 3, 1823, Dom Pedro I called the nation's first Constituent Assembly, mostly to begin drafting the nation's first constitution to consolidate independence and establish a stable government. However, later on, the assembly dissolved due to conflicts about monarchical powers versus legislative authority.
The surrender of Portuguese forces happened shortly after in 1823, and the siege of Salvador ended on July 2nd, marking the final Portuguese redoubt remaining in the territory of Cisplatina.
A year later, in 1824, the last Portuguese garrisons and naval units left the country, ending the fighting. Thanks to Thomas Cochrane, a famous Scottish naval commander who led the Brazilian Navy.
Although Brazil could be considered independent now, its social hierarchy was still extremely similar to a colonial social structure, being highly reliant on slavery for everything.
Actually, in the first constituent meeting that happened in Brazil, José Bonifacio called for an abolishment of slavery, calling it a deadly cancer that threatened the foundations of the nation, and proposing the idea of a gradual abolishment of slavery to still preserve society.
The slave trade in return for the coveted recognition by Britain. However, Brazil struggled to implement this, as many illegal slaves continued to be brought in until slavery was abolished as a whole in 1888.
Thus, the social hierarchy of Brazil remained race-based in a reflection of the white-owned colonies, with white people at the top of the color, whether freed or enslaved at the bottom.
Well, you see, at the time, Britain was incredibly powerful. They controlled the economy, the trade, and had a very powerful army and navy. Essentially, it went something like this.
Yo, Portugal, we're independent now.
Let's ask Mom.
Ah, nice.
And that just about wraps up how Brazil gained independence from Portugal. There were a few more hurdles, including how Pedro I eventually gave up the Brazilian throne to return to Portugal to become king there, but that's a whole nother story, and don't worry, I won't put that on the test. The Brazilian War of Independence was a prime example of the effects of imperialism, as Brazil began as a colony of Portugal. There are arguments to both sides of whether or not the Brazilian War of Independence changed the lives of people. You see, the initial Portuguese royals settling in Brazil created a much stronger economy that was carried on even after Brazil earned independence, but the social hierarchy was still highly divided by race even after the quote-unquote end of the slave trade. Therefore, the war somewhat changed the lives of the people. The whites were on the top, then followed by free blacks, and finally the slaves that were still illegally being brought into Brazil. The Brazilian War of Independence had major long-term effects, primarily consisting of a relatively stable monarchy. They preserved colonial structures like slavery and social inequality for decades, regardless of the attempt to abolish slavery during that time. So, what do you, the viewers, think about the Brazilian War of Independence? Bro, who wrote this script?